started. We celebrated our 158th anniversary. We had some wonderful treats during worship service, took some home to eat later for days and days. They were so good for a couple days after the anniversary celebration. And today, I'd kind of like to focus in on what we are now, who we are now as St. Paul Church. Because as was brought to me last Sunday, someone said to me, wouldn't it be nice if we could have that many children in Sunday school again? Wouldn't it be nice if we could have that many families in our pews? And I said, how are we going to do that? People don't like it when they ask me a question and I ask them a question back. They don't like that because, it's a we here. It's not just me. It's not just you. It's all of us together have to figure out what we're going to do. And as I've been thinking about that over the week, an old memory of my early days here at St. Paul came to me. So I'd maybe been here, I think maybe I'd been here about a year because I had a mailbox. And when you get a mailbox, you know you've arrived here at St. Paul, right? They put you in the line of mailboxes and you know somebody is knowing that you're in the building. And I think I'd been here about a year. And things were shifting kind of rapidly here because things were going to start happening here that this church had never done before, right? Can I just cut to the chase right now, and I could end my sermon right here. The church is always going to be asked to do things it has never done before. Someone should have said amen. Thank you. Thanks be to God. Sermon's over, right? But anyway, we had a particularly, I remember when this happened, we had a particularly rough Sunday. And by rough Sunday, I mean that there were some feathers ruffled that day. And so during the week that ensued after that feather ruffling Sunday that we had, I went to my mailbox and I opened it up, and there was a piece of paper folded over nicely in my mailbox. And I picked it up and I opened the mailbox, I opened up the letter, and it had just one sentence in it. Pastor Jana, stop trying to make this church Willow Creek. No name. Now let me tell you something. I'm just going to take an aside here and tell you something. As an organization, if you spend time answering anonymous letters and worrying about anonymous letters, your organization is unhealthy, right? It's the same principle of that getting the telephone call and hearing, well, there are some people who are some people? Well, there are these people that don't. Who are these people? We don't deal with that, right? We don't deal with that because if you can't own your complaint, it's just like voting. You can't complain if you don't vote with your name, right? So we don't deal with that. So, being who I am, circular file. Missed it, but I picked it up and put it back in there. But also being who I am, I ruminated on that for days. Just ruminated and ruminated and ruminated on it for days. And I remember that what was happening at the time was that thing right there was being talked about being put in the sanctuary. The holy house of God was going to have one of those things put in it. And it was going to cost us $10,000, all right? That little projector and that little screen system was going to cost us $10,000. Now, think about that. That was about 10 or more years ago. Think what it would cost us now if we were just playing catch up to the need that this brings for us, right? This fills a need that we have. And so I settled myself down a little bit and I thought, well, the thing is that people are feeling like change is happening around us. So whoever wrote that note to me, whoever, if you're here, I forgive you. If you're online, I forgive you. Whoever wrote that note to me was feeling like they were afraid of the change that was going to be happening here. This screen represented a church that they did not know. It represented, you go out to Willow Creek, they got huge screens, right? I remember sitting in the pews at Willow Creek, and they're not pews, they're chairs, which I wish that we had, but I'll make us Willow Creek in that way some other day, all right? But I remember the first time I ever went out to Willow, and it was a nighttime service, and all of a sudden I heard this and the screens were coming down on the sides of the window to prevent the light from shining off of the water, and I was frightened because I'd never been in a church where they pulled the screens down on the side of you. What was going on? Were they locking us in here, or what was going on? I had no clue what was happening. This anonymous note reminded me that this flexibility that God asks of us, that Christ asks of us, is sometimes very difficult for us to deal with. And that what was happening was that when that projector and that screen would go in, we were going to start preaching in a different way. We were going to start using film clips. We were going to start projecting songs up on the screen. We were going to start singing music that maybe wasn't in the hymnal that came from the 1950s. That sort of stuff was going to start happening. And so I could have a bit of empathy for whoever it was that was so frightened that they needed to write down what their fear was on a piece of paper and leave it for me anonymously. But the most ironic thing happened a few months after receiving that note. I happened to be at a conference at Willow Creek. A lot of folks know that there's conferences that happen at Willow Creek all the time, and sometimes we go out there because they are excellent at bringing in people who help you understand what it means to be in ministry in the modern day century, right? Not in 1863, not in 1910, not in 1972. They are excellent at helping you get connected with people who can teach you how to be the church in 2021, all right? So I was at this conference, and we were sitting there, we were learning, we're talking about team leadership and all this sort of thing, and I remember distinctly that the leader of that conference, I can't remember who the person was, maybe it was that gentleman Leoncini who does the leadership leading or something like that, but I remember distinctly that this is what he said: the church of the 21st century has forgotten what Jesus' leadership model was, what his model for ministry was. Now, when you're sitting there with a group of pastors, let me just tell you, when another leader says the church has forgotten, those pastors immediately go defensive, and they feel like he's talking about me. He's talking about me, that I have forgotten what it means to be a leader in the church. And he says, I'm not trying to point any fingers here because it is the church universal. We even do it here sometimes at Willow. We forget what it means to be the church in the 21st century because it's so nice to hang on to all of that stuff that we remember, those traditions that we had as the church way back when. My friend Chuck Maney told me one time, he's a pastor in the United Church of Christ, he once said to me, Jana, do you know what tradition is? And I said, no. He said, it's peer pressure from dead people. So anyway, this leader says, here is Jesus' ministry model. This is the ministry model. This is the church building model that Jesus had. Jesus went out into the streets, and Jesus recognized the needs of the people in the streets. And Jesus prioritized those needs by urgency. And then Jesus marshaled the troops, equipped the people around him to go back out into the streets to meet those needs. He said that is the ministry model of Jesus. Jesus, and I'll never forget this, he says, Jesus never intended for any of us to become a corporation. And so somebody, of course, raised their hand and said, well, what do you mean by us becoming a corporation? And he said, the corporate model of thinking is this: develop a product, tell people out there that you have it, and tell them if they want it, they have to come to you to get it. That's the corporate model of thinking. And he said, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus says, I have what you need, and I'm going to bring it to you wherever you are. I'm going to prioritize the needs that you have, and I am going to meet your needs where they are at. Jesus never expected anybody to come to him and sit there and wait for him to give it to them. And then he said, the church has taken on the mindset of the corporations of the world who want people to come to them because they think that that's the person's responsibility. Jesus teaches something wholly different. He teaches that what we have, what he gives us, we are to go give away, not hold on to it until someone might show up at the door asking us for it. I've tried ever since that time. This is probably about 2008. I've tried about 2007, somewhere along that. I've tried ever since that time to remember that our job as the church is always to figure out, to go out and help people tell us, what it is do you need? And then prioritize those through what we can do and try to meet those needs as much as we possibly can. You see, the church took on this mindset throughout the millennia that what we had is what everybody needed and that they would come to us to get it. That's why the churches of the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s and even into the mid-70s were places where you had packed to the rafters in the pews on Sunday mornings, was because it was based upon this attractional model that the corporations have. How do the corporations attract us? They fill the airwaves with all this commercials and all of this advertisement about what they have that we need. But they don't bring it to our doorstep and say, here it is for you. They ask us to get in our cars and drive to the store and spend an exorbitant amount of money on what it is that they're selling and buy it and bring it home for ourselves. It's the exact opposite with the Christ model of ministry. It is going out and saying, what do you need today? How can I help you today? What is it that might help your soul today? That's the Jesus model. It's not saying, hey, Jesus filled me with joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Come get it. It's not that at all, right? Or Jesus gave me peace like a river. Come get it. If you come to me, I'll give it to you. It is, Christ has filled me with a sense of peace and a sense of joy and a sense of love and a sense of belongingness. And I want to share it wherever I can. What do I have that I can give to you? You see, the corporate model of ministry is we have what you need and you need to come buy it from us. And the Jesus model of ministry is we have been given, so we give it away. We walk out the doors into the streets of Barrington and say, what do you need today? And we ask those questions, and we are willing to do what it takes to give it to whomever needs it. Now, I know that there's this specter about Barrington, okay? There's this specter about Barrington that they don't need anything, right? That there's not a person in Barrington that needs anything. And I even did some research on this while I was thinking about all of this concept this week, because the median household income in Barrington is $186,000. Did you know that? I don't know very many people that make $186,000. I really don't. But we have this concept that because Barrington is this wealthy, small place in Illinois, that there's no one who needs anything. There is no one that needs to be given joy or needs to be given hope, that needs to hear the good news of Jesus Christ about how God is walking beside us all the time. There's no one here that needs anything that we have. So we might as well just stay in our churches and hope that they show up on the doorstep. And then when they show up on the doorstep, we'll surround them as fresh people that came in the door and let's get them in here. That's not what I think Jesus has called this church to ever do. Remember, I told you the story last week about how we were always seen as the liberal Germans who were giving away too much? That's our heritage. Our heritage is being a church that goes out and gives. And in those pictures that you saw on the passing of the peace this week, you saw pictures that were from one of the worst times this church has ever faced since I've been here. Pandemic. The pandemic has required of us to be so flexible that we were gathering on little screens with one another. just with the need to see one another. You see, if I had wanted this church, or if God had wanted this church to stay the way that it was in 1950, I would have been so inflexible. I would have been lacking flexibility, and I would have said, we're never going online. Forget it. We're going in the sanctuary. People can wear their masks. They can stand away from one another. We're never going online. You see how we have to adapt to what the new needs are. And what I can say to you is that we are probably never, ever going to leave behind that kind of technology until the next thing comes when we have to adapt again. This pandemic has shown us who we are. We are the people at St. Paul United Church of Christ who are called to say, what is the need? How can we fill it? How can we make sure that people have what they need? And so what we did was we figured it out. Thank God that God sent Steve here with me. You know that a pastor's husband doesn't have to go to the same church, don't you? But thank God he came here with me, because God knew we were going to have this need at some point. God knew we were going to need that screen. God knew we were going to need that projector. And God knew that we were going to need laptops and what are those things called? iPads and telephones and cameras and all that kind of stuff. And the great chances are, the very large probability is that had we not been flexible enough to move into that new calling of ministry when the pandemic hit, there would no longer be St. Paul United Church of Christ. Churches who were not flexible when the pandemic hit are churches that are today closing their doors. I just heard the story of a 168-year-old church, a church that's 10 years longer in the world than we are, that has decided to close because they could not be flexible enough to meet this new need. Churches who got so frightened that things were so different that they stopped giving their money to help the ministry of the church grow are closing their doors. But that's not what St. Paul is. St. Paul, since I've been here, has always been the church that has said, okay, something different is happening on. We're a little scared, but how can we meet this need? A food pantry grew up in the midst of the pandemic. We had been talking about it, like I said before, for 2.5 years. St. Paul Suppers is still feeding people. Thanksgiving boxes are still being given out. People are still signing on to the iPads and the telephones and the YouTube so that we can all be in worship together with one another. You see how we're rising up and being flexible. But here's what I need to tell you. The church of the future is going to need us to be even more flexible. The church of the future is going to have many more changes. We may not be in this building in 10 years, but we'll still be a church. We may be totally separated from one another, but we'll still be a church, because the church is not the building. Remember that old song? The church is not the building. The church is not the steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is the people. And the people are called to remember that Jesus said, go out into the streets, ask what people need, train people to help, and then fulfill those needs. So the question the church of today has to ask itself is, are we ready to do that? And are we willing to do that? Because being ready and willing to do that might mean that we don't have the same old stuff that we've had for 158 years. It might mean that we keep the best of the traditions, like the grit and determination that we talked about last year. It might mean that we keep about us some of the things that we like communion and greeting one another, those sorts of rituals. But it also might mean that we have to completely redefine what it means to be the community together. You see, while the church of the past required being in a place together, the church of today and tomorrow requires the commitment to be together. We might not have a place, but we will still be the church. Are we flexible enough to meet that need? Is our tough question. Amen. We come now to the time in our